Good evening, friends. Good to be back with you in our sixth night of looking at the 66 books in 66 days. We've been through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and now we're going tonight to be entering into Joshua. I'm going to post this video along with our Bible Project video on Joshua. You can watch it ahead of time, and then tonight we'll again have our time together and study with some questions and answers. Before we begin tonight in Joshua, though, I want us to have a little bit of closure on the book of Deuteronomy. Several questions were asked after we got cut off the internet last night, so I encourage you to go back to the teaching from the questions and answers from last night and look at the end of the comments to a handful of questions that were asked so that we can have some closure. Hopefully the internet will stay up tonight so we can finish. But I want us to take a look at Deuteronomy 34, which talks about the death of Moses. And Deuteronomy 34, beginning in verse 5, we read this. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. But to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Verse 9, Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and all his officials, and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power performed by the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. And so as we think about Moses, Moses, who was the man who did not want to get sent to Egypt because he was, as he said about himself, slow to speech, as we read in Exodus chapter 4. He delivered 3 addresses to the Israelites, to Israel, to make up the book of Deuteronomy. God gave him the power to develop from a stuttering shepherd into a national leader and a powerful orator. His courage, his humility, his wisdom molded the Hebrew slaves into a nation. But Moses was one person who did not let success go to his head. Moses knew that he was not the reason for the greatness. He knew that it was not any greatness in himself that made him successful. It was the greatness of the all-powerful God in whom he trusted. There were a great many powerful prophets during the time of the kings, but it would be more than 1,000 years before one greater than Moses would appear, and that would be Jesus. And you can read some things about that in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. The book of Hebrews talks about Jesus being greater than Moses, writing to the Hebrew people to say, yes, Jesus came as the Messiah, as the one with authority, because he truly is greater than the angels and greater than Moses himself. And so, since we know that Moses had laid his hands upon Joshua, making Joshua ready to be the next leader, Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom, and the people were ready to follow him. So that gets us into the book of Joshua. There's a lot of geography and places throughout the book of Joshua that are very important, because it's the places that the Israelites would conquer as they were moving to claim the promised land. There's the campsite, the camping at Shittim, The Israelites under Joshua were ready to enter and conquer Canaan. But before the nation moved out, Joshua received instructions from God right there at the campsite in Shittim. There's the Jordan River. We know about the crossing of the Jordan River. There's Gilgal, the crossing at the Jordan River. They camped right after they crossed into a place called Gilgal, where they renewed their commitment to God and celebrated the Passover. So this really, early in the book of Joshua, there is a celebration of the crossing over, the beginning time of receiving the promised land. And so they commit themselves to God in Gilgal and celebrate the first Passover after crossing the Jordan River. There's Jericho. We know the story of Jericho, where the walls of the city came tumbling down. When we know that from maybe our vacation Bible school or a Sunday school lessons when we were young, or teaching our own children. But the city was conquered by obedience to God, marching around the walled city of Jericho, and you can read about that in chapter 6. There's the victory that was had over Ai, and we can read about that in chapter 7 and 8. There's the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. There's Gibeon, the valley of Ajalon. There is Hazar up north in Hazar, where King Jabin mobilized the kings of the surrounding cities to unite and crush Israel, but God gave Joshua and Israel the victory, and so that's in the area of Hazar. There's Shiloh and there's Shechem. So these are some names that'll come up throughout the book of Joshua as the Israelites moved their way through under the power of God and under the leadership of Joshua himself. And so it is thought that Joshua is the author of the book of Joshua. The purpose of this book is to give the history of Israel's conquest of the promised land, written, of course, to the people of Israel in the setting of Canaan, called the Promised Land, which occupied the same general geography territory of modern-day Israel. And so you can kind of get an idea on the map where that is. The key verse that comes out of the book of Joshua for us is chapter 1, verse 11. God tells Joshua, "Go through the camp and tell the people, get your supplies ready. 3 days from now you will cross the Jordan here to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you for your own." And so that's the excitement of everything that the past 40 years had been building up to, the ready for the crossing to receive the land of their inheritance, a place they could call their own. And so the key people that come up in the book of Joshua are, of course, Joshua, Rahab. We're going to learn about Rahab, Ebal. Ebal is a mountain. So it's Joshua, Rahab, Achan, Phinehas, and Eleazar. And so those are some names that will come up as we're reading through Joshua. And so we look at the blueprint. There are 3 divisions in the book of Joshua. There's the entering of the promised land, conquering of the promised land, and then dividing the promised land. 3 very specific time periods of movement and receiving. So entering the promised land, chapter 1 through chapter 5, or the first part of chapter 5, Joshua leads the nation and they cross the Jordan. And in this, Joshua demonstrates his faith in God as he takes up the challenge to lead the nation. And several times God tells Joshua to be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. And so chapter 1 celebrates the entering into the promised land. Joshua leading the crossing of the Jordan. When you get to the middle part of chapter 5 through chapter 12, it's the conquering of the promised land. Joshua attacks the center of the land. He attacks the southern kings and he attacks the northern kings. And then there's a summary in chapter 12 of all the conquest. And I don't know if you're like me, but it's kind of worrisome to me, because we've been at war. There's always been war as human beings have been on this earth. I struggle when I read the Old Testament about God having a people group conquer and overpower, demolish, smash, overpower really another people group. But they were doing it out of God's obedience. And so this always raises up questions of what about war today? Is war today ordained by God? Are there reasons, good reasons to ever go to war? I don't have the answers for that. But what I know is that there are lessons for us that we can learn out of the book of Joshua for the conquering that took place, the attack on these cities. Joshua and his army moved from city to city, cleansing the land of its wickedness. And that's the reason that God sent them into the land with armies and with strength, so that they could wipe out all the wickedness and the evil that had been destroying just the relationship that humanity was having with God. And God told them, destroy every trace of idol worship. And so we might talk about that a little bit tonight, or what our feelings are about war. I know that when we read some of the words of Jesus, we find that Jesus knows that there's going to be wars. We find that in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about those kind of wars. And as I look this up, I want to read part of Matthew 24 to us so that we can kind of understand. It's the signs of the age. Jesus says, Matthew 24, verse 5, "For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. These things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes." And so Jesus talks about, this is the way that that things are going to be. And so we have to think about how do we rationalize, or should we even rationalize war? How do we even fight battles ourselves, battles within us? What does Joshua teach us about the war between our flesh and our spirit? And I think that we can look at those themes throughout Joshua and say, why was God ordaining this? Why was God calling the people group Israel to go and to conquer and attack? And I pray that as you read it, you will be able to answer some of those questions for yourselves. So the second section, after entering the promised land, the second section of Joshua is all the conquering that took place from chapter 5 through chapter 12. Chapter 13 through chapter 24 is the dividing up of the promised land to the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. Each tribe receives their land. Special cities are set aside for very special purposes. Eastern tribes return home. The tribes that said, okay, we came and we helped our clans and our brothers fight the battle and get to the point of being able to receive after the conquering. Now we're going to go back home because we had asked in the beginning, give us land here on the east side of the Jordan. We promise we'll go help you fight those battles, but then we are going back home. And then the ending part of Joshua is Joshua's farewell to Israel. Joshua urged the Israelites to continue to follow the Lord and to worship him and him alone. The people had seen God deliver them from many of their enemies and miraculously provide for all their needs. And I believe that God is still doing this for us today. And so what does it mean to receive that land, to receive that inheritance, to receive the promises of God? And so the themes that rise up out of the book of Joshua talk about success matching up with faith. God gave success to the Israelites when they obeyed his master plan, not when they followed their own desires. Victory came when they trusted him rather than in their military power, their money, their muscle, or their mental capacity. They were winning those battles because they were being obedient to God. And when they weren't obedient to God, that's when the trouble came. There's also the success moving and mingling with faith. The Israelites demonstrated their faith by trusting God daily to save them and to guide them. And so that's another theme. Guidance rises up. God giving instructions to Israel for every aspect of their lives. That's why his law was so important, the law that guided their daily living and specific marching orders that gave them victory in all those battles. So with success and faith and guidance, there was Joshua's leadership that was an example as an excellent leader. And leaders today can take the example of Joshua and live out that leadership of being strong and being courageous and leading with integrity. And then there's the theme, of course, of conquest. God commanded his people to conquer the Canaanites and take all their land. Completing this mission would have fulfilled God's promise to Abraham and brought judgment on the evil people that were living there. Unfortunately, Israel never finished the job. The battles got left undone. Some of them did. The land rested for a lot of years, but there was still a responsibility for them. And as you move into the end of chapter 23 and 24, you hear Joshua talking about there's still a responsibility in the conquest that the Israelites would have in front of them. And so when we hear about the promises of God throughout Scripture to take the land, it began in Genesis chapter 12. God promised to bless Abraham and make his descendants into a great nation. In Genesis 15, God would choose the right time for Israel to enter into Canaan. And Genesis 15 speaks about that. There's going to be a right time for you to enter into Canaan land. In chapter 17, God makes a promise to give all the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants. Exodus 33, God promises to help the Israelites drive out all the evil nations of Canaan. And so even when the spies crossed back over and said, no, we can't go over there, and only Caleb and Joshua said, yeah, we can do this. We got God on our side. We can do it. God still held the promise together that the Israelites would be able to drive out all the evil. That's the key, that the driving out of evil. And so when we look at the conquests, we have to realize that the people that were being moved out of the land or killed through battle were not good people. And you can read through Joshua, you can read through a lot of the Old Testament text, you can even read through Judges, which we'll do soon, that talks about the evil and the horror that the people that were not following the one true God, the way they lived their lives, and the true evil that came out of not following God. In Deuteronomy 4, the Israelites were to be an example of right living to the whole world because they needed to be holy and separate and set apart because they could not intermingle with the wickedness of the Canaanites. And so they had to, in order to receive the promised land, they had to have this understanding of holiness and being set apart. In Deuteronomy 12, the Israelites were to completely destroy the Canaanites, their altars, so nothing would tempt them away from worshiping the one true God. And so God's plan for the promised land took place in the beginning of Scripture in Genesis, as early as Genesis 12, and we find it in Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, the call to conquer and to cross over the Jordan and begin to fight those battles. And so tonight when we come back together, we will have some questions and answers. So I encourage you to kind of thumb through the book of Joshua, listen to the overview. I'm going to post here in a little bit the teaching on the Bible Project and their overview of the book of Joshua. We'll come together tonight with some fun learning about Joshua, and maybe be willing to take a deeper look at wars and why war exists, why it still exists today. And that may be a hard conversation for us, but I think it's important for us to make that consideration and to meditate on it and to give it to God, and even take it to the place where we battle and war in our own spirit, and how we can receive balance when we are strong and courageous. Multiple times through the book of Joshua, God tells Joshua to be strong and courageous. And so one of the questions that I'm going to be asking you is, how many times does God tell Joshua to be strong and courageous, or how Joshua hears that from God and shares it to the Israelite nation? How many times can you find that? And you might go and Google it, but it's more fun if you actually find it in Scripture and go, there it is, it's there, let me mark that, there it is there. And then towards the end of the book of Joshua, I believe we find it again. So I'll leave you there with that. Study hard, have a good time, and I'll see you for question and answers at 8 o'clock tonight. Peace be with you. Bye-bye.